Welcome to the Museum of Plastic. I'm Alice Bell and I'll be your tour guide today. The fact that you and I are here today to learn about the story of plastics is a miracle in itself. The 21st century was one of the most tumultuous in human history. If the 20th century was the story of humans at war with ourselves, then the 21st felt like a war with our home. And yet here we are, on the other side, at peace with our planet at last. No human creation symbolises the struggle of the last 300 years more than plastic. A material that once helped alleviate pressure on the environment would grow to become a massive environmental threat in itself, before finally playing a key role in the solution. During our tour, we'll relive the history of plastics from the 19th to the 22nd century. We'll explore why plastics were created, how the ways we make them have changed, how the science evolved, and finally, its effect on the environment. We'll learn about the people who led us, and more importantly, the billions of individuals, at first one by one, later as a huge collective movement whose actions have changed the world. Humans have finally learned to play their part in a living ecosystem that is larger than themselves, and we've become a more sophisticated, caring civilization in the process. As we follow this story, it's important to remember that even though humans have taken some truly short-sighted actions, they were at other times giving, inventive, and brave. If you have questions, there'll be time at the end of each section for us to talk more and reflect on what we've learnt. Take a look at Dirty Nature's iconic mixed media painting. Created in 2021, this mural is an early example of work that lived both in the physical world, in South Africa, and in the 3D virtual world. Created to start a community conversation about our throwaway ways, it depicts the plastic-filled landscape of the early 21st century, when single-use plastic was a social addiction. Yet the focus of the painting is a charismatic, determined backpacker striding into the distance. It's almost as if the plastic suspended in midair is being drawn into their backpack. Some see this as a comment on the power of activists, beyond direct action, by simply being an activist, by living differently, by unleashing the exponential wave of unexpected consequences. You change the world. By the end of the 20th century, plastics had seeped into every part of human life, with production doubling every decade between the 1950s and 2010s. For many involved in the plastics industry, what they were producing was a utopia. Abundance, joy, life-saving technology and simple convenience, all making trillions of dollars and employing millions of people. The main reason why the plastics grew at such a pace? They were cheap, they made people money, and they were convenient. Throughout the 20th century, customers were sold the idea of a throwaway culture, where they could buy disposable products and buy again, without thinking too much about where those products went afterwards. Customers bought into the idea, partly because it was sold to them so cleverly and aggressively by advertisers, but also because it was easier just to use and throw away, rather than worrying about where all the plastic waste was going or how to reuse. Very few people stopped to ask, where does 1 billion tons of plastic come from? Welcome to the industrial wing. It's quite a change, isn't it? Here you'll come face to face with the life cycle of plastic in the late 20th and early 21st century. It's a story of a time when there were no commercial plastics without oil. For a long time, people were only aware of the damage that plastic waste did to the environment when it was thrown away. They didn't really appreciate that every step of the plastic production process contributed to climate change. So, you're at a plastic factory and you've got a pile of pellets ready to be melted back down and moulded into some kind of plastic product. There are two fundamentally different types of plastics that could be created. Some, called thermoplastic, softened when they were heated, and because they softened, you could recycle them and reform them into something else. Today, we use far fewer plastics than we did 100 years ago, and 98% of those that we create now are thermoplastics, so they can be easily recycled. And then there's what's known as thermoset plastics. These do not soften and reform again once moulded. This is because at the polymerization stage, their molecules have been reformed into such strong chains that they couldn't be broken down again at any meaningful rate. They cannot be used again or recycled. Back in 2020, only 9% of plastics created were ever actually recycled, and roughly half of all plastic created were just single use. In other words, despite the carbon-intensive process that had created it, the product would only ever be used once. Used once! Say a straw or a disposable plastic lid as part of a lunchtime drink. This isn't unrealistic. Back in the 21st century, plastic packaging like bottles and bags and wraps and films represented 40% of all plastic made. It took the great policy reforms of the 2020s to transform society and prevent those thermoset plastics, except in, really specific necessary cases where they made something we really needed to keep using. So that's where 1 billion tonnes of plastic came from, but where did 1 billion tonnes of plastic go once it had been used? It's shocking to us now in 2121, but plastic manufacturers in the early part of the last century weren't thinking about what happened to their products after they'd been used. They just didn't see it as their problem. Until the mid-21st century, plastic was either landfilled, recycled or incinerated, all imperfect methods and all very costly to the environment in their own way. For a long time, incineration was the most common way to dispose of plastics, and this method had the highest environmental impact. It is estimated that in 2015, 6 million metric tonnes of CO2 was emitted by incineration in the US alone. Landfilling and recycling have their own environmental costs too. For years, wealthy countries in the global north would simply transport their waste and send it to nations in the then poorer global south. This practice was eventually banned worldwide, and each government resolved to take responsibility for the disposal of their own plastic waste. The good news is that all of this is history. 100 years on, we can look back at it from a safe distance and ask, how did the world get to this place? Moreover, we can also ask, how did it get out? To answer, we have to go back to the basics and add a sprig of science into the mix. So follow me down, let's go! Today, we're used to the idea that plastic doesn't have to be made from oil, but humans at the start of the 21st century still sometimes found that hard to understand. In the 2000s, 99% of all plastics were oil-based. To choose an everyday example of how much has changed, just think about the simple act of writing. In the 20th century, pens were the most popular writing implement. Billions of so-called ballpoint pens were made from oil each year in the 20th century, and then thrown away, to the point that the brand Bic celebrated the sale of its 100th billionth pen in the year 2005. These pens were still being found washed up on beaches well into the 2090s before those final ocean cleanup efforts. We'll hear more about that in the next wing. Meet Leo Baekeland, the inventor of Bakelite. This didn't conduct electricity and was heat resistant, so was considered the perfect material for the new electrical tech revolution of the early 20th century, well suited for radio and telephone casings, as well as kitchenware, clocks, toys and firearms. But Bakelite was innovative in another respect. It was the first plastic made from fossil fuels, specifically coal tar. Before Bakelite, plastics were derived from plant or animal materials. Baekeland's two main predecessors, John Wellesley Hyatt, who invented celluloid, and Alexander Parkes, who invented Parkinson, had looked to wood pulp as the basis for their materials. These chemical explorers of the late 19th century believed in a new era of materials which took ingredients from the earth and built products that would change the human world. It might seem hard to believe now, but in a way, those early plastic entrepreneurs were kind of saving animals, not driving them to extinction. People like Hyatt and Parkes and Baekeland, they were mainly driven by economics and not environmentalism, but their new materials replaced shellac, tortoiseshell, baleen or ivory, meaning insects, turtles, whales and elephants didn't need to be killed for a billiard ball, a comb or a shoehorn. In 1940, Henry Ford had his own bioplastic dream, a soybean car. It was also powered by a biofuel made from hemp. In 1941, he even made a prototype. It made less and less sense to continue investing in bioplastics as fossil fuel-based products boomed after the First World War. Bakelite paved the way to further oil-based inventions. Polystyrene in 1929, polyester in 1930, PVC and polyethylene in 1933, and nylon in 1935. This would characterise the next 100 years, becoming the dominant paradigm. The idea of plastics coming from fossil fuels is, in some ways, the newer one. Like electric cars, which were popular before petrol or diesel-based ones caught on, it took until the mid-21st century before bio-based plastics would really catch up. There were still many issues to overcome before bioplastics became plausible on a large scale. They weren't a simple answer and suffered quite a bit from being overhyped at first. Initially, they weren't that biodegradable, they were expensive to produce, and they weren't as versatile as their alternatives. However, after consumer demand shifted in the 2020s and sizable investments were made, a bioplastic world seemed achievable, and since the turn of the 22nd century, 94% of plastics have been bioplastics. Practically speaking, it doesn't matter much what plastics are made of. To be plastic just means you have certain defining features in your molecular structure. They're polymers. They're molecules made up of long repeating chains. They're also plastic in the sense that by applying heat and pressure, they can be changed, transformed into something else. That's what gives plastic its changeability, its most distinctive quality, that it can be almost anything. Consider just how many different types of plastic goods there are, with vastly different qualities: squidgy or firm, lightweight or strong, see-through or colourful. While it doesn't necessarily matter how plastics are made from the perspective of producing, selling or using them, it can make all the difference from an environmental standpoint. To transition from the disposable fossil fuel economy to a circular renewable one was no mean feat. It was a huge paradigm shift in human society, in human culture and human economics, and a long time in the making. There were widespread records of despair and eco-anxiety in the 2010s and 2020s, and yet still the voices of change were getting louder in that period. A whole new world had been conceived of by the 2020s, with a decade of sustained targeted change-making following the coronavirus pandemic of 2020-2022. These ideas were ready to be slotted. It's impossible to choose just one hero in this story, which is why all around you can see the faces of over 200 people who had a role to play. These people include environmental campaigners who saw through and challenged the fossil fuel economy, scientists who studied our Earth and raised the alarm, engineers who invented solutions, philanthropists and investors who financed a revolution, economists and thinkers who envisioned the circular economy, singers, actors, artists and other pop culture figures who raised popular awareness. In the 22nd century, despite a population increase of 42%, we use only a quarter of the virgin plastic we did 100 years ago. This is partly because we need less, as most of the plastic in use is recycled from what was already in existence. New eco-materials like Galalite and Ezranol have been developed by AI. They're super sustainable and increasingly popular. But most of all, human habits have changed. Some attribute this to humanity learning the lessons of the last century, others to new technologies freeing us up from costly physical assets. But there's no denying that, as a civilization, humans have become more minimalist. That said, large quantities of new plastic supplies are still needed, and for this we have a circular model. This means that companies are fully responsible for what happens to their products at the end of their use. This has led to a renaissance in product design, and there has been a 98% drop in humanity's single-use addiction. Some striking features of this are as follows. Biowaste, the inedible parts of plants, for example, has become the basis of about 63% of these bioplastics. Ocean agriculture of kelp farming provides material for a further 20%. The final 17% of the ever versatile plastics of today come from other products like tapioca, seaweed, vegetable fat, corn, sugarcane, and even human feces. There's also new innovations when it comes to gene editing agriculture, which open up a whole new path for the plastics of tomorrow. By using a system of eco-factories, when plastic products first hit the mainstream in the mid-20th century, they offered hope, they offered colour, they offered a utopian new world of possibility. A dark, unexpected undercurrent sat behind that utopia, though. And yet, despite setbacks, humans worked tirelessly together to combat the environmental destruction they brewed up for themselves and other species here on Earth. Learning to work together, to change behaviour, and to create materials responsibly allows us to, today, live happy and beautiful lives. This was no simple achievement, nor is it a time for breathless celebration. We all know someone who has been affected by the climate crisis, and we all carry that with us. The plastic remnants of the fossil fuel economy are some of its most dramatic, and certainly some of its most long-lasting. We'll now move to our fourth and final wing, where we'll confront some of the most painful impacts of plastic, but we'll also follow some of the most uplifting stories it sparked too. In Rasselis's majestic, colourful creation, drawing on his signature African geometrical style, a future world was imagined in which technology transformed from harmer to healer. On the mural, plastics are the culprit, and the seahorse is trapped by a plastic straw. In the digital extension to the piece, the two majestic seahorses are a celebration, as this new technological world we live in puts wildlife centre stage. Silis's artwork For decades, warnings about climate change and biodiversity loss were largely ignored. It seemed almost impossible to get people to act, even in the face of these most pressing of environmental crises. Plastic had embedded itself deep within these crises. Colossal amounts of CO2 were added to the Earth's atmosphere simply to satisfy humans' appetite for plastic goods and packaging. And that's before even touching on plastic waste or the CO2 emitted to transport all these goods around. The devastating losses of the mid-21st century demanded an urgent shift in behaviour from humanity as a whole. But those whose wealth and power relied on fossil-based industries like plastics were slow to change, and their lack of action further fueled the disasters. Campaigners searched for a symbol, a story, something to exemplify the changes that were so desperately required and spur action on a global scale. This is a hologram of the now extinct emperor penguin and its chick. There were once millions of these majestic birds, their colonies living in great cities of ice. As their homes melted faster than even the most dire predictions, they were one of too many species that did not survive the 21st century. The release of one of the most harrowing pieces of VR footage from the 21st century would change things though. One of the last wild emperor penguins was seen trying to save its chick from a plastic beer ring. This was a tipping point for concern that had been mounting for decades, and the public mobilised like never before. Instead of focusing on the penguins, campaigners made a surprising move. They told the story of the plastic beer ring. They told the story of the birth of plastics, its growth and dominance in the marketplace. They told the story of the detrimental side effects and its impact on thousands of species. But they also told a story of billions of people changing their mindsets and behaviours in order to heal the world. They told a story of hope. Follow me and we'll find out more about the story of plastics and the environment. The oceans do a lot of work for us, not least absorbing carbon dioxide. There's an entire sea civilization out there playing an integral part in creating and sustaining the Earth's ecosystem. Burning fossil fuels, erupting volcanoes, and simply people breathing all release carbon into the atmosphere. But the ocean, just like the soils and plants, acts as a so-called carbon sink, breathing it back in. Whales like the one here in this gallery are part of that. They munch up carbon in their food, storing it in their fat before dragging it deep down into the bottom of the ocean when they die. The whales, how can I put this? The whale's excrement also helps feed other ocean life, helping other species suck carbon out of the air too. The secret to the ocean's carbon sink is invisible to the naked eye. Phytoplankton are tiny plants at the base of the oceanic food chain who turn CO2 into oxygen with photosynthesis, just like plants on land. They're so small you could fit 1,000 in a millimetre. Zooplankton are tiny aquatic microorganisms which eat the phytoplankton and whose fecal pellets, poo, sink deep into the bottom of the ocean, storing the CO2 far out of harm's way. These microorganisms were the foundation of the ocean's age-old food chain, feeding everything from the tiny zooplankton to massive whales. But by the 1960s, a new predator emerged, affecting large and small in the ocean and undermining the entire ecosystem: plastic.
Phytoplankton, tiny, mostly single-celled organisms that live in the oceans, creating energy for our ocean's ecosystems. They're eaten by zooplankton, slightly larger organisms that make a daily trek from the ocean's sunny upper layer to its pitch-black depths. In this cycle, they drift through an important region, a dimly lit middle ground between light and shadow, an area scientists call the twilight zone. Enter the export processes in the ocean from remote sensing, or exports project, a team of more than 150 scientists from 29 different institutions on board 2 research vessels with a fleet of autonomous vehicles, traveling west from Seattle to study these phytoplankton. The team, made up of researchers from NASA, the National Science Foundation, including the University of California, Santa Barbara, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, and other university and agency partners, will deploy robotic explorers and instruments from the 2 ships to study the diversity of plankton in the ocean. The ocean absorbs approximately half the carbon dioxide from Earth's atmosphere. Like plants on land, phytoplankton take in this carbon and release oxygen. Their blooms can be seen in images taken from space. As the phytoplankton die or are eaten by zooplankton, that consumed carbon is exported into the twilight zone and stored there. Understanding the diversity and makeup of plankton in the ocean can help scientists understand the role the ocean plays in consuming and sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. In turn, understanding this process can give insight into the ocean's carbon cycle and how it helps regulate our home planet's changing climate. Phytoplankton, tiny, mostly single-celled organisms that live in the oceans.
Already in the 1950s, soon after plastic production exploded, word was that plastic was being ingested by sea turtles. By the 1960s, researchers had documented plastic in the stomachs of seabirds. By 2021, the seas were dirty, polluted and toxic, with uncountable pieces of plastic in the ocean. Already by the 1950s, not long after plastic production exploded, word was out that plastic was being ingested by sea turtles. By the 1960s, researchers had documented plastic in the stomachs of seabirds. By 2021, the seas were dirty, polluted and toxic, with
Oh, it's a crystal actually. Green agate.
It wasn't just that these large pieces of plastic were littering the ocean. Once in the water, the plastic would slowly break down into microplastics, which were toxic to the phytoplankton. Once in the water, the plastic would slowly break down into microplastics. These were toxic to the phytoplankton. In fact, the phytoplankton population dropped 40% between 1950 and 2010. The ocean's role as a carbon sink was in jeopardy. And this is to say nothing of the impact on the food chain. As the phytoplankton populations plummeted, oceanic life entered a crisis point. In response to this, governments began making regulations to limit plastic entering the oceans, and, through a series of decisions made during the UN conferences of the 2020s, this became international law by 2027. But these late preventative measures weren't enough on their own. After all, the ocean was already home to trillions of pieces of plastic. Countable pieces of plastic in the ocean. One of the most impressive human achievements of the last 100 years is our transformation of the oceans back into a vibrant living ecosystem. Despite the loss of life and disasters we have faced, we can say that we have come out stronger. The ocean revival was a battle fought on many fronts, and here we're going to focus on the story of the cleanup. The seeds were planted in the 1980s when climate activists organised beach cleanups, setting their eyes on capturing the so-called dirty dozen. By 2015, tens of thousands of people worldwide had volunteered for the unglamorous chore of picking up rubbish from beaches. These operated alongside passion-led crowd-finance projects like the Ocean Cleanup Initiative of the mid-2010s, which used vast netting systems to retrieve huge amounts of ocean-borne plastic. Initiatives like these were the first steps in recovering our oceans. This used vast netting systems to retrieve huge amounts of ocean-borne plastic. Initiatives like these were the first steps in recovering our oceans. Starting in the 2010s, clean-up dives took this a step further, developing into one of the most popular eco-sports of the century, scuba cleanup. Here, participants competed to pick the largest amounts of ocean litter. These sessions had a huge impact on clearing areas near land, like rivers and beaches. In the 2040s, the use of sea drones offered a step change. Here's the iconic Model O, which swept up 1 ton an hour, sending it up to wind-powered recycling ships on the ocean surface. Automating the work of the human divers of the 2020s, drones sustained ocean cleaning at greater depths and further from the shore.